So today we're going to talk about the lungs and the pleural cavity. And to understand the pleural cavity, basically we'll start off with a description of how the pleural cavities are developed and how they're lined by serous membranes. So to begin with, let's consider this is a picture of a fetus. So these are the limb buds here. You're kind of looking at a cross section through a typical fetus of any animal. This would be dorsal. This would be ventral, and here's the developing heart, which is ventral to the two developing lung buds. And basically the lung buds initiate their development dorsal to the heart, and classically it's described that these buds will push down and into, so the inside of the green here would be inside the pleural cavity. They push down and into these pleural cavities, so they never get inside of it, but they push up against it, and eventually they develop ventrally. So they push down, the lung buds push down and ventrally into the pleural cavity, but they never enter it. And subsequently, the lungs and pleural cavity go down ventrally till they surround the heart. All right, so they go in this direction. And eventually, when we look at a mature animal, you'll see that the lungs are lateral to the heart. And classically, it's described as pushing a hand into an inflated balloon, with the analogy of the lung bud being the hand and the pleural cavity being the balloon. So you can see that the inside of the balloon, or the green space, is inside the pleural cavity. And if these lung buds are like a hand pushing into the balloon, they're pushing down and against the balloon and changing the shape of the balloon, but they're never entering the inside of the balloon. So to continue on, we need to define pleura. What is pleura? Pleura is a serous membrane that covers the lungs and lines the wall of the thorax. So this is a cross-section through the dog about the level of the 6th thoracic vertebrae, and it'd be a caudal view, that cross-section. Pleura is again a serous membrane. And what is a serous membrane? It's a smooth membrane consisting of a thin layer of cells that excrete serous fluid. And what is serous fluid for? It's for lubrication. All right, so obviously in the thorax and in the pleural cavity area here, you're going to have a lot of movement as there's expansion of the chest when you're breathing, and the lungs are expanding, and they basically are right up against the chest wall, but they're not stuck to the chest wall per se, but there is movement here. So all of these structures are covered by pleura, or serous membranes, and these membranes again secrete a serous fluid which lubricates the whole system here. So we're going to name these pleura. Now, as said in the app, the pleura is a continuous membrane. So if you consider these pleura, you have to think about them as a continuous membrane, and they're just named by where they attach and where they are located. So pulmonary or visceral pleura is that pleura attached to the lung, and that would be the light blue pleura. So this would be this light blue line here that I'm running next to. This would be an example of pulmonary or visceral pleura. So when you hear the term visceral, you should start to recognize that that means it's basically something associated with an organ. So pulmonary pleura lines the surface of the lungs. And when I say they line the surface of the lungs, it means this pleura is intimately attached to the lungs, and you really can't tease it away. It's adhered to and attached directly to the lungs. Parietal pleura is that pleura attached to the outer thoracic walls. So parietal, just as visceral is associated with organ, you should get used to thinking that parietal is associated with any kind of wall, and that'll come up later. Parietal costal pleura is the pleura covering the inner surface of the ribs, or the yellow line. So this yellow line here on both sides of the animal left and animal right, lining that inner thoracic wall or intercostal wall on the inside of the ribs, that is parietal costal pleura, and you can see you can find it on either side here, the yellow line, parietal costal pleura. We're continuing on with some other types of parietal pleura, or wall type pleura. Parietal diaphragmatic pleura, so this purple structure here would be the diaphragm, and it would be lined, the cranial surface of the diaphragm is lined with parietal diaphragmatic pleura. Parietal mediastinal pleura. Parietal mediastinal pleura would be that dark blue covered pleura here that covers the mediastinum. So again, all of this pleura, so we just went through describing pulmonary pleura that's light blue, parietal mediastinal pleura that's dark blue. It's all continuous, and then it comes out here again as parietal costal pleura as yellow. It's all continuous. It's a serous membrane, and it's named by its location. So when pleura covers the mediastinum, it's referred to as parietal mediastinal pleura, or these dark blue lines here. Now, an important clinical term and an important thing to understand for you is the mediastinum. So what is the mediastinum? The mediastinum are the two layers of just defined parietal mediastinal pleura. So by two layers, I mean animal right and animal left. If this is a caudal view of a cross section, this would be animal right, this would be animal left, to your left as you view it. So this, on the left side, this parietal mediastinal pleura, which is dark blue, and on the right side, the parietal mediastinal pleura, which is dark blue. These two layers and anything in between them by definition is the mediastinum. So if we shade it in with gray and we're including those two blue lines, anything within this gray space is considered to be within and part of the mediastinum, or the hallway. So basically this is the space between the left and right pleural cavities and left and right lungs. Okay? So enclosed within the mediastinum are structures and organs such as the thymus, the heart, the aorta, trachea, esophagus, vagus nerves, and vena cava, which we'll talk about later. Rather semantics, but still it's important to understand, is that when parietal mediastinal pleura, so we define this dark blue line as parietal mediastinal pleura, which it is, but when it comes across and courses across the surface of the heart, it's referred to as pericardial mediastinal pleura. So if you were to consider basically the pleural spaces in pleura, if an X-ray beam, this is a caudal view, so this is animal left, this is animal right. As this X-ray beam went from A to B, or from animal left to animal right, if you were asked to identify the pleura and pleural spaces as the beam would travel from A to B, what would you say? Well, you would start off with, you can see these are all continuous, but the X-ray beam would first hit this layer of yellow, which would be parietal costal pleura. It would then hit this green space, which would be pleural cavity. It would hit this light blue line on the surface of the lungs, which would be pulmonary pleura. It would then course through the lungs and hit the light blue line again, which would be another layer of pulmonary pleura. It would then hit this dark blue, which would be parietal mediastinal pleura, only in this case it's covering the heart, so it would be pericardial mediastinal pleura. It would then pass through the pericardium and things we talk about later, and then it'll hit the dark blue layer again, which is another layer of pericardial mediastinal pleura. And basically then you could reverse this order as you go out of the animal, because you would hit again pericardial mediastinal pleura, pleural cavity, which we left off here, but there would be another layer of pleural cavity in here. There should be a layer of pleural cavity between the last layer of pulmonary pleura and pericardial mediastinal pleura. So we'll run this back out. Pericardial mediastinal pleura, pleural cavity, light blue pulmonary pleura, lungs, pulmonary pleura, pleural cavity, and parietal costal pleura, and then you're out. So basically this would be, if you're coming straight across at the level of the heart from animal left to animal right, these are the layers of pleura, or pleural spaces, you would hit. A couple other important points about the pleural cavities. There is basically by default in us, there is no communication between the right and left pleural cavities. So these green space is the pleural cavity. So you can look at this diagram and see that there is no, because of the mediastinum is complete, there is no communication between the right and left pleural cavities. This is true in us. Now in the domestic species that you work with, I would say that basically this is inconsistent. So in dogs, cats, and larger animals, there can be an incomplete mediastinum and there can be some communication between the right and left pleural cavities. But the important point is not to sit there and worry about it, but the point is understanding that a clinician is talking to you about communication or a complete or incomplete mediastinum. An incomplete mediastinum means there's communication between the right and left pleural cavities. A complete mediastinum would not allow that. And in cases such as pneumothorax or collapsed lungs, in our instance, it would have clinical significance because it means one lung can collapse on one side and the other lung can still function because there's a complete mediastinum and there's no communication between the two sides. But in animals, you have to be prepared for inconsistencies in the completeness of this mediastinum. Another very important point, the lungs are not contained within the pleural cavity. So again, this green space is the pleural cavity. The lungs are not inside of that. There's nothing inside the pleural cavity, just basically a small amount of serous fluid for lubrication. So the lungs, even though I said they push down, like they're pushing your hand pushing into a balloon, they push down and into the pleural cavity, they are not inside of the pleural cavity. Another important point is that pulmonary pleura and parietal pleura. So let's consider pulmonary pleura, this light blue pleura lining the lungs here, and this parietal costal pleura is this yellow layer here. In reality, these are right up against each other, and this big space isn't happening in you or me or any of the animals we look at, that these two layers of pleura are right against each other. And as a matter of fact, they adhere to each other like two wet planes of glass. So if you ever had two wet planes of glass and you tried to separate them, you'll find that they slide across each other easily, but they're difficult to separate. And that's the same setup you have between the lungs and the thoracic body wall, or the mediastinum or the diaphragm for that fact, because these lubricating layers of pleura keep the lungs up against the wall. So when the thorax expands, the lungs expand with it. But you can't have the lungs just sticking like glue to the wall. They have to basically adhere to it, but still be able to slide along the wall as they adhere to it. So the other important point too is that within the pleural cavity there is a negative pressure. Okay, so inside the pleural cavity relative to the outside atmosphere there is a negative pressure, and that also helps keeps the lungs up against the inner costal wall and the diaphragm and the mediastinum. Any kind of opening in the pleural cavity, so let's say classically, let's say in the animals there's a hunting accident and an arrow breaches or a gunshot wound, or let's say a dog gets hit by a car and the rib is broken and it punctures the pleural cavity. This will release that negative pressure and you can get what's called a lung collapse. So basically, theoretically, highly theoretical, what happens, and they don't collapse this much, but you can see the lung recoils back to its origin, and as it does, it takes with it the pulmonary pleura, and you get a bigger increase in the space of the pleural cavity. So let's consider a few things here. Real briefly, I'm going to go over the differences between a tension and a non-tension pneumothorax. So if you go down, this is describing non-tension. If you go on the right, on the left, down is a non-tension. On the right is a tension pneumothorax. And I'm just going to briefly talk about this, but let's talk about what this means. So in both cases, let's consider that blunt trauma causes an infiltration of air into the pleural cavity and basically causes a loss of negative pressure in the lung recoil. So in both instances, non-tension and tension, this occurs. Well, as you go down this and compare them still, in both instances on inspiration or taking a breath, the thorax expands and it fills with air. And let's consider this is again highly theoretical, but let's think with this wound or the puncture, outside air can be sucked in through the pleural cavity into the inside of the pleural cavity from the outside. And then here's where the difference exists between tension and non-tension. So in a non-tension, when the breath is released, the thorax can still empty, air can exit out through the mouth and the nose, and also maybe out through the breach or the wound. And basically the thorax returns to pre-inspiration or pre-breath-taking volume. In a tension pneumothorax on expiration, so consider that you're taking in all this air into the pleural cavity, and basically you have a breach where maybe you can say there's a little flap that goes after the air goes in. It's a one-way valve, but air cannot be released. So this prevents air escape from the thorax, and the thorax is fixed at maximal expansion. So basically what this is like is taking a deep breath and not being able to release it. So obviously this is a very tenuous position, And the difference between tension and non-tension is then you need to put a trocar into the pleural cavity to release that pressure before the patient can begin to breathe again. And in a non-tension, you don't have this problem. The patient, like in humans, the patient can breathe with a good lung as long as the bad side doesn't fill with air and keep the lung from not being able to expire or release its breath. But this tension pneumothorax is why you see oftentimes in television shows like they're pounding a trocar into a patient with a collapsed lung. That's to relieve that pressure so they can breathe again. This is a radiograph of a dog hit by a car, and this is an example of a pneumothorax. So this is the heart, this is the diaphragm, and things we'll continue to work on. But basically the space here between the lungs and the body wall is not normal, so this is a slight, but this is a more realistic recoil of the lungs back away from the body wall, and you can see this big space here in the ventral area, and we'll work on these things as we go through this class. The heart should be down against the sternum, so these are examples of a pneumothorax, and this text down here talks about that. Okay, some comparative aspects. We've been focusing on the dog as we do. So this is the left lung, this is the outer lateral surface, right lung is over here, left lung is over here. This is cranial on both instances. The caudal is to the outside of the page. Okay, so when you look at surfaces, there are differences. The second images here are of the horse, again, left, right, cranial to the middle, caudal to the outside. And then the cow is finally down here in this image. Again, this is the right lung and the left lung. And there are some basic differences to consider when you think about these species. One is the formation of the individual lobes. So in the dog, you can see there is quite easily to see on the right and left lung, there is formation of lung lobes. In the horse, this is not true. There are no individual lobes formed in the lungs of the horse. In the cow, there is also salient or obvious formation of lobes. And one of the other differences between species in the cow, you can see these little fissures, and these are called lobulations. So there's much more lobulation in the cow lungs than the horse or the dog. So there's some general differences that really physiologically or functionally are hard to describe why they're there, but these are just some general differences you should be aware of between the species with respect to their lungs. Cardiac notch is a term you should be aware of. This is dog lung, so this is right side, this is cranial. This is caudal, and the different lobes are labeled here. But that's a space where the heart and pericardium, so here you can see it's this yellow shaded area, the cardiac notch. This is a space where the heart and pericardium are accessible to needle puncture for like a pericardial tap. This is where you can access the pericardium through the thoracic wall without the danger of puncture of lungs. And again, on the right side of the dog, this is between the cranial and middle lobes. So this is the cranial lobe. This is the middle lobe on the right side, and this space in here is called the cardiac notch. You should be aware of that term and what it means. A space accessible to pericardial tap without hitting the danger, reducing the risk of hitting the lungs. A term you should also be familiar with is, with respect to the thorax, is pleural effusion. By definition, this is increased fluid in the pleural space. And when this happens, the borders of the individual lung lobes are obvious. So this is some reasons why pleural effusion occurs. You don't have to be worried about that. But basically, if you're interested, this can talk about why you can get fluid in the pleural space. We're talking about fluid inside the yellow space in my schematic or inside the balloon. And as an effect of that, what do you see on a radiograph? Well, think about gas, fat, fluid or tissue. When we're talking about the radiographic opacities, and then we'll say mineral. So you think about the opacities here. So again, if X-ray beams go through these things, they're going to hit the film. So here's your film. The X-ray beams are going to have an easier time passing through gas, overexposing. This will be dark, so this part of the film will be darker. If you go through mineral, not as many X-rays are going to hit the film, it's going to be lighter, right? So basically, these different opacities here between fat, fluid, and gas, if you have fluid in here, it's going to change the normal look of the radiograph. So we can even go back to this radiograph back here at the collapsed lung. See all this black space? That would be an opacity relative to gas. So you cannot see, even though this animal has a collapsed lung, we can see a little bit of a fissure here. You can't see the individual lung lobes. But when you change the different opacities in that thoracic cavity because of fluid in the pleural cavity, you can now easily see the lung lobes because of the differences. So this is the difference between fluid opacity and gas opacity. You no longer see that gas opacity in here. And basically you can see the discrepancy between the lung lobes and the fluid. Some other concepts about the medial lobes of the lung. You should be aware what the principal bronchus is. That's the first branch. So as the trachea comes down, we'll talk about this more later, but the trachea comes basically from the mouth, it's going to the lungs, and there's a bifurcation. So this is the trachea, and it bifurcates. This is referred to as the principal bronchus, as it bifurcates and goes to the right and left side to supply the lung. So obviously there's one on each side. So there's two principal bronchus. And again, this is the first branch of the trachea to the lungs on each side, and each principal bronchus will basically then, the principal bronchus will divide into lobar bronchi, and that depends on the number of lobes there are in the lungs, but they will divide into lobar bronchi. So here in this image here, you can see there's some lobar bronchi on the medial surface of the lung. Pulmonary artery, you started to go over this you'll go over this more with some parts of the app where you talk about where the blood goes to and from the pulmonary artery and the medial surface of the lungs. The pulmonary artery splits into right and left pulmonary artery. So here you can see this is the pulmonary artery in the medial surface of the left lung. It's usually cranial to the left principal bronchus. The right pulmonary artery is usually ventral to the right principal bronchus. The pulmonary artery delivers unoxygenated blood from the heart. And these vessels do not supply the actual lung tissue itself. This is accomplished by the bronchial arteries branching from the aorta. But this is blood coming to the lung tissue from the heart to be reoxygenated. And finally, pulmonary veins. So you can see here's pulmonary veins. These return oxygenated blood from the lungs to the heart. There's usually one single vein for each lobe. Okay, so these are just important structures you can see in the medial surface of the lung. The accessory lobe, now this is a dog lung, and this is the cranial aspect again, and you're looking at the medial surface here now of the lungs. Important thing to note is that the right side of the lung also has an accessory lobe. It's only really visible from the medial aspect, and there's a sulcus through that for the caudal vena cava. So sometimes students are a little bit confused about where the accessory lobe is. It is part of the right lobe, and it's found on the medial aspect. Let's go over some surface projections then of the thorax. These are very clinically relevant. So to begin with, let's talk about the pleural cupula. The pleural cupula is this purple-like line, well, it is a purple line extending cranially through the origin of the thoracic inlet. This is the cranial extent of the pleural cavity through the thoracic inlet. It's referred to as the pleural cupula. The line of pleural reflection. The line of pleural reflection is a line which runs from the 8th costal cartilage to the basically dorsal-caudal to the angle of the last rib. So if you mark the angle of the last rib and you mark the 8th costal cartilage, that line that runs between those 2 points, curved caudal, basically you can see kind of caudal ventrally here. That curved line is a line of pleural reflection. The basal border of the lungs is the actual caudal ventral border of the lungs. It parallels the line of pleural reflection, so we just define the line of pleural reflection as this line right here between the angle of the last rib and the 8th costal cartilage. Well, the basal border of the lungs is the, again, caudal ventral border of the lungs, and it parallels this line of pleural reflection. It's cranial to it, and basically it runs from the 6th costochondral junction, or this blue X, up to the second to last dorsal aspect of the second to last intercostal space, which is shown here with the red X. And again, it parallels, is cranial and parallel to the line of pleural reflection. The costodiaphragmatic recess is the potential space between the basal border of the lungs, or this green line just defined, and the line of pleural reflection. So that potential space between those two lines is referred to as the costodiaphragmatic recess. So thoracentesis is a clinical procedure used to access the pleural cavity in order to withdraw fluid or blood or pus or air or gas for diagnostic or therapeutic reasons. So let's say the optimal site for thoracentesis or thoracentesis in the dog, and let's say we're going for fluid in the standing dog because fluid within, so we're talking about accessing. What are we accessing here? The pleural cavity, or basically the inside of that balloon that we talked about, or that green space in the schematic. So you're looking to access this without hitting the lungs. So the place to do that would be the cranial to the line of pleural reflection and caudal to the basal border of the lungs. So in the standing dog, because fluid is going to be gravity dependent, or a dog laying on its chest, fluid would go down. It would be right in here within the 7th or 8th intercostal space. So this this red hashed line would be an area where you'd sample for fluid and thoracentesis in the standing dog or the dog in ventral recumbency. So you're accessing inside the pleural cavity without running the danger of hitting the lungs, or basically getting, you're still in the line of pleural flexion is the caudalmost extent of the pleural cavity. So you're still getting within that pleural cavity without hitting the lungs. And that's what this basically says. So even though you are accessing the pleural cavity with a needle, the thought is that if you don't nick the lung and the pulmonary pleura in the lung, you can really reduce your danger of pneumothorax. So with a small needle, you can go in and be careful and basically get inside that pleural cavity and get the sample without causing lung collapse. But if you nick the lungs, you're going to increase your risk of pneumothorax. Let's think about the diaphragm a little bit. The diaphragm is often very confusing to beginning anatomy students. So the caudal extent, or the caudalmost aspect of the diaphragm, is a line of pleural flexion, which we just defined. The angle of the last rib to the 8th costal cartilage. The cranial extent, now this is flipped around, so this is a cranial view, right aspect. So here's a line of pleural flexion reflecting that caudal aspect of the diaphragm. Cranially, it extends like a dome, so the lungs are removed from this image so you can see it. Cranially, it extends from the line of pleural flexion, it extends as a dome all the way up to the caudal aspect of the heart. So this is the heart, and the heart goes from the 3rd rib to the 6th intercostal space, and we're going to talk about that. But the diaphragm goes all the way up to that caudal aspect of the heart around the 6th intercostal space, and it sits as a dome. So it projects as a dome. So it attaches to the wall here, projects as a dome, and then it goes back and you can't see it, but it would go back and attach to the line of pleural flexion on the other side of the animal. So it just sits here as this big dome. So here you can see the diaphragm is, now we're looking at a basically dorsal view. If we were to cut the animal into dorsal and ventral halves and look down on the ventral half from a dorsal aspect, this line would represent the diaphragm, and you can see that it's bulging forward, so this would be cranial, and this would be caudal. The diaphragm is bulging cranially like a dome, okay? So on breathing, on inspiration, when you take a breath or an animal takes a breath, the thorax will expand in 2 directions. It'll expand laterally due to contraction of the intercostal muscles between the ribs and some other smaller associated muscles. And caudally, it'll expand due to a contraction of the diaphragm, which goes from this dome shape to basically, if you will, a more flatter shape. And the diaphragm can do this because it consists of contractile skeletal muscle. So breathing, for us, fortunately, is a voluntary event, and when you take a breath, the diaphragm is innervated by the phrenic nerve, the diaphragm contracts, and this expands the thoracic in a caudal direction, and thereby the lungs go with it. We talked about how the lungs are adhered basically to the thoracic wall and to the diaphragm because the pleuras are adherent, because they're both lubricating. It's like 2 wet planes of glass. So when the chest expands, the lung expands with it. Now, one question that comes up a lot is, well, how does the thorax expand? Because you have these intercostal muscles that go from rib to rib, and they basically, when these muscles contract, we talked about this in 115, what happens when a muscle contracts? It gets smaller. So theoretically, intuitively, it would seem like all these ribs would collapse against each other like the closing of an accordion. Do you even know what an accordion is out there? You probably don't, because I'm dating myself, but look it up. Google an accordion. But basically, when the accordion closes on itself, you would think that that's how this would react, because these muscles would just pull the ribs together. But there is a model called the bucket handle model of respiration, and it's kind of interesting. So we're looking at a dorsal view of a cow, but this could be any animal. It could be us in a standing position. So basically, the ribs, the key here is that the ribs are curved caudally, like a bucket handle. So we'll consider this to be cranial and this to be caudal. So we're looking at the thoracic, the ribs, and the thoracic vertebrae, lumbar vertebrae, thoracic vertebrae of the cow here. So the bucket handle itself articulate dorsally with the vertebrae and ventrally that we can't see here with the sternum. So again, they're just like a bucket handle, but they curve caudally. And then upon inspiration, these muscles, these intercostals, basically contract. And because the key here, the first rib is fixed. So the first rib doesn't move. So basically all the other ribs are pulled up to the first rib. So the first rib is immobile, but there's all these intercostal muscles between all the ribs. So rather than just pulling them down together, they're caudally curved like a bucket handle. They're pulled up to the first rib, and by doing so, it's like lifting up a bucket handle. So you can see that when you go from the bucket handle being down to lift it up, both cranially and laterally, you can see that you expanded the thoracic cavity from this image at that width to this width. So that's how basically the kind of the anatomy of respiration, how these intercostal muscles and how taking breath, how the thoracic cavity expands in a lateral direction via the ribs and the intercostals. A couple more important points about the diaphragm. There are three major, this should say, openings. All right, the first is the aortic hiatus. So you're looking at the abdominal surface, if you will. This is ventral, this is dorsal, the dog diaphragm. This would be animal left, this would be animal right. And dorsally within there is the aortic hiatus. The hiatus is a term for a gap, cleft, or opening, dorsal part of the diaphragm. The aorta, azygos, and thoracic duct will pass through this opening. The second opening we'll consider is the esophageal hiatus. It's centrally located, ventral to the aortic hiatus, as you would think. It's there for passage of the esophagus from the thorax to the abdomen. And finally, the caval foramen is to the right and ventral of the esophageal hiatus, and that's for passage of the caudal vena cava. So let's continue, and this is also from the app, but let's go through some definitions again and let's wrap this up with some thoughts of the thorax. So what is the thorax made of? And what's made of, the thorax itself is the outer shell. It consists of the ribs, the thoracic vertebrae, and the sternum. So this blue shaded area, ribs, sternum, thoracic vertebrae, that shell makes up the thorax. The cranial aspect of the thoracic cavity would be the thoracic inlet. So the thoracic inlet is the opening bordered by the body of T1, the first rib, and a manubrium. So this is the thoracic inlet. That is the entry into the thoracic cavity. So this blue shaded area is the thoracic cavity. The caudalmost aspect of the thoracic cavity is the diaphragm. And what did we say the caudal aspect of the diaphragm was? It was a line of pleural-reflection from the angle of the last rib to the 8th costal cartilage. So this purple space in here, inside of the ribs, and inside of the thoracic cavity, inside of the thorax for that matter, is specifically the thoracic cavity. And finally, the pleural cavity, which we talked about. The pleural cavity extends caudally to the line of pleural reflection. So the line of pleural reflection represents the caudal extent of the pleural cavity, and cranially, just beyond the thoracic inlet that we just defined as the body of T1, the first rib, and the manubrium. So this little part of this pleural cupula, which we defined earlier, the pleural cupula extends cranial to the thoracic cavity. This is the pleural cavity, okay, or the area where you would find the inside of balloon. Now, obviously, you're going to find a right and left on both sides. So again, here's an overview, and this is from the app. You can see blue is thorax, hashed line is a pleural cavity, yellow is the thoracic cavity. So let's look back one more time at our thought on the thoracentesis. We said for fluid, this was the green line is the basal border of the lungs, the blue line is a line of pleural reflection. So the line of pleural reflection is, again, line of pleural reflection. That's the caudal extent of the pleural cavity and thoracic cavity, and also where the diaphragm is. So basically you have this pleural cavity extending to this space. The green line is the basal border of the lungs, the caudalmost extent of the lungs. So we said that when you did a thoracentesis, you wanted to sample the pleural cavity without hitting the lungs. Well, where are you going to do that? Well, obviously you're going to have to do that between its caudalmost extent. You can't go caudal to the line of pleural reflection, or you'll be beyond or caudal to the pleural cavity. You have to go cranial to that line. But you have to go caudal to the basal border of the lungs because you don't want to hit the lungs. And that's within this space, which we define as a costodiaphragmatic recess, or the space between the line of pleural reflection and the basal border of the lungs, and in the 7th to 8th intercostal space for fluid in the standing dog. And for gas, you'd have to go higher because gas would raise. Fluid is gravity dependent. So a couple more thoughts here, and that is, one is, if we were to look at this image again, so if you took Roxy, and I wouldn't want to do this, but he sawed her in half, and he removed her dorsal half, and you look down ventrally at the view of the thorax. This is what you would see. Here's your left lung, here's your right lung. The lungs are surrounded by what would this blue line be? This blue line would be pulmonary pleura. This red line lining the inner wall, the costal wall of the thorax would be what? That would be parietal costal pleura. This dome-shaped structure going cranially into the thorax would be the diaphragm. This yellow line lining up against the diaphragm would be what? It'd be parietal diaphragmatic pleura. This blue line, dark blue or purple line, would be what? Well, in this region here, it would be parietal mediastinal pleura because it's not lining the heart, but as soon as it comes across the heart and starts lining the heart, it would be pericardial mediastinal pleura until again it gets continuous with the yellow line. So the important thing here, again, is to look at these parietal pleuras and see how they are all continuous. They all run together as one, and again, they're just named by where they run. Now, we can't see its connection, but it does eventually connect with the pulmonary pleura that lines the lung, and we can't see it because of the level of our transection, but that's what we do. So in our image here, I said that the line of pleural reflection is the caudomost extent of the diaphragm. It goes from the angle of the last rib down to the 8th costal cartilage. And I also said that the basal border of the lungs goes from the 2nd to last intercostal space to the 6th costal chondral junction. So thoracentesis was in the 7th or 8th intercostal space between these two lines. So where would you find that if you're going to do basically thoracentesis on this schematic? Where would that space be? Well, obviously, right here where, we'll look on this side over here, right here where the red line, the parietal costal pleura becomes parietal diaphragmatic pleura, that exact intersection there would be the line of pleural reflection. Or where parietal costal pleura is becoming parietal diaphragmatic pleura. This space here, the pulmonary pleura, would be the caudomost extent, or you'd be looking at the space right here in our transection, that would be the basal border of the lungs. So this space here between the basal border of the lungs and the line of pleural reflection, the schematic, that's where you would do your thoracentesis. Again, what are you trying to do? You're trying to access the pleural cavity or this green space without hitting the lungs. And this is just Roxy.